So now I'm excited to introduce John Darnton, celebrating the release of Burning Sky. John Darnton has worked for 40 years as a reporter, editor, and foreign correspondent for the New York Times. He was awarded 2 George Polk Awards for his coverage of Africa and Eastern Europe, and the Pulitzer Prize for his stories that were smuggled out of Poland during the period of martial law. He will be in conversation with Stephen R. Weisman, Vice President for Publications at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, who previously served as a correspondent, editor, and editorial board member at the New York Times. He served as the New York Times bureau chief in Japan and India, as well as senior White House correspondent. So now, please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, John Darnton and Stephen Weisman.
Hello, party crew on a brilliant Saturday afternoon.
Thanks again. Enthusiasm.
Well, can anyone hear me? So thanks everybody for coming on a beautiful day to listen to a beautiful. Okay, can you hear this? Okay, to listen to a talk about a beautiful new novel by John Darnton, and I'd like to say before I lob the first softball to John. He and I have been friends for longer than we care to remind people. We started out together at the New York Times as assistants on the Metropolitan desk. We were on Night Rewrite together. We were at City Hall together in the 70s before John went off for his great career as a foreign correspondent. Later, John was my editor when I was overseas. I was his editor when he was in London. And he's had a fantastic career at the New York Times, winning every journalism award imaginable, including the Pulitzer. But he has also had this career as the writer of these thrillers that are oriented around science innovations gone bad. He's done that with cloning and artificial intelligence. And this new novel, which is so interesting, and I don't want to spoil the story of it, is about the nightmare of climate change and in the even worse nightmare of attempts to protect the Earth from climate change. So I'd like to talk to you, John, about 3 different things. One is how you have made this career for yourself and how you got into climate change in this novel. And then we'll get into the political dimensions of the novel. And finally, what I think is really interesting for those of you who know you is the very personal part of it, because it's a story of a journey of a man who's in search of his father's identity, which I think is a story that you've told brilliantly in another of your books. As a memoir. So, John, first of all, how did you get interested in this particular subject, and how much research? It's obvious you did a lot of research into the science, as you always do. So tell us a little bit about
Sure.
that.
This is working. Okay. Well, you're right. This is my 6th novel. And 5 of them deal with science on some level. And I find, I don't call it science fiction. I like to think of it as science adventure, because for the most part, it's real current science, only then carried to somewhat of an extreme. So, for example, in my very first one, which was called Neanderthal, I did a lot of research on Neanderthal, and I thought, I actually read the Washington Post, which had a story that said Neanderthals existed at the same time as our predecessors, Cro-Magnon, which I hadn't realized. I always thought they were some offshoot on the great tree of evolution. But it turns out if they existed with our ancestors, why did they die out? Why did we win? What did we have that they didn't? Or what did they have in the negative way that we didn't? So I posited the idea that there was a remnant band of them still living way off in the Pamir Mountains, where they would be better equipped to survive. And an anthropologist, a paleoanthropologist, discovers them, and they go to study them, and the humans, us, ignite a kind of war that might have happened 30,000 years ago, a kind of Pleistocene Holocaust, to explain it. So that's the idea of taking science and then adding a certain element to it. Usually it means the world is fine, something happens to knock it off its axis, and by the end of the book, will it come and sweep back to a normal, will it be restored? So in this case, unfortunately, I'm really dealing with the reality of global warming, which is obviously here. It's obviously man-made. And it's obvious to me, at least, that we're headed for catastrophe unless we undertake some kind of collective action to fix it. Now, there are people out there who are toying with the idea of what's called geoengineering, some huge change in the universe that would lower the temperatures on Earth. And that sounds like a good idea. But it may invoke nature's favorite law. And I'm sure you all know what that law is. It's the law of unintended consequences. And in this book, that's what they do. It's called solar radiation mediation. And you may have read these stories about people who want to put a giant mirror up in outer space to send back the sun's rays. In this case, the idea is you send up little particles of sulfur, and the sulfur particles will reflect back a certain amount of sunlight. I heard of this proposition many years ago from my nephew, who's a physicist, over a Thanksgiving dinner. And he was explaining how there's no reason to worry about the future because we'll be able to solve it with this thing. And I said, are there any negative, any downside? He said, oh, well, we won't be able to see the sun. I said, can't see the sun. How about the stars? No, won't be able to see the star. The moon? No moon. And I tried to, can you imagine the Earth without our connection to the cosmos? Everything that means that, it stirs these feelings of terror and awe and majesty in us. If that's gone, what are we as humans left with? So that's the basic kind of science of the book. But then you need a plot. So a simple plot of a family, 3 generations, beginning next year, over the next 70 years, which will be the critical time for us all. I mean, either we're going to solve it by the end of that period, or we're all cooked, frankly, literally. I believe, there are those who would take issue with this, but I think it's pretty clear that we're not doing enough to really solve it. So there are 3 generations, and the first is a kind of a very cantankerous elderly man who's been raising the alarm. If you think of Hansen from Nassau, you may have heard of him. He's got a wonderful record of talking about this for going back for years. In my case, this person, actually, the character, worked for Esso. Believe it or not, years ago, Esso was on to the question of climate change and studying it, and even allowed some scientists to publish papers pointing out the dangers. And then somebody there woke up to the fact that they were going to be, they're cutting off their own bottom line, and they did a shift and became climate change deniers, which is typical of the fossil fuel industry. Anyway, so that's the first character. And he comes to an interesting fork in the road. And his fork ends. But he does have a 4-year-old son. And the boy is brilliant, but very flawed. And he becomes a central character. He is a scientist, and he figures out how to actually engage this geoengineering scheme, which is called the Cocoon, because that sounds very comforting and cozy. We all live inside a cocoon now. And things go wrong, as they might in real life, according to some of the scientists who've studied it. But he has a son and a daughter who are estranged, and they become leaders of the resistance to overturn this kind of misbegotten scheme and to do him in. And so it doesn't end on a down note. It's not all doom and gloom, but it is for the first half of the novel. But we all come out, you'll be happy to know, we come out alive, pretty much.
So thanks for that. I was a little worried I was going to tell too much of the plot.
Which I just did.
Which you just did, but it does have a fascinating ending, and it takes you along a journey. So from that Thanksgiving dinner, was it immediate? Did it immediately click that this is your next thriller?
No, because that was actually many years ago. So I just kind of put that idea on. I didn't even have the idea. I put the thought, the dangers of a kind of the future on a shelf, and worked on something else, on a memoir. But I guess the idea was always kind of there. And every time I picked up the New York Times and read another story on how dire things were getting, I don't know if you have that same experience. I mean, you almost don't want to read the stories, right? Because it can fill you. It can ruin your perfect Saturday afternoon. There is a kind of interesting new tendency in the climate activist movement now to not emphasize the dark side and to talk instead about positive changes and things that are improving. And I guess there is some improvement. But I tend to say we still need to raise the alarm a little more. But in answer to your question, no, I did not start working right away. It was actually took about 10 years or more.
So how do you go about when you're thinking of a novel? You must be on several tracks, including the plot and having compelling characters. But let me ask you first, how much research you did into the science? There's a fair amount of interesting scientific stuff in the book, and about sending up rockets. I kept thinking of Elon Musk sending up rockets. And I'm sure you thought of this before Elon Musk took over the space industry. But how did you go about doing your research, and what was that like while you were thinking through the plot?
I'm glad you mentioned Elon Musk, because that is sort of in the back of my mind. Yes, that is the prototypical character of this main person I was talking about, the brilliant but flawed scientist who's got this kind of arrogance that humans can do anything, and brings us to the brink of catastrophe. Well, once you get the basic idea that there's going to be a scientific development, then you need a person to kind of engage the action. I had for some years back a wonderful editor at Knopf, Sonny Mehta, who used to run it, and he said, "Forget plot." He said, "Just concentrate on character. If you can get a character right, it will be engaging." I wish I could follow his advice, but frankly, I find plot comes easier to me than character. And Norman Mailer often said, you have to choose one or the other, and I think it would be an ideal universe if you could do both. But so I think of this idea. I think, all right, something's going to go wrong, and there has to be a person who makes it go wrong, and then somehow by the end, it has to turn 180 degrees so that the normalcy is restored, or quasi normalcy. So there has to be a development to allow that to happen. I usually don't work out the entire plot, but if you can have a beginning and then know more or less where you want to end up, then it's fun to try and get there. And you always leave some questions unanswered so that you retain interest yourself. You're not just filling in the lines. And you get excited when you start thinking about it late at night. Well, this could happen or that could happen. That's basically the way I work. The other key thing is I've discovered something many years ago in my very first book, when I was, sweating it out in front of the then typewriter, and a foreign correspondent named David Lamb, whose widow is with us here today, asked me over a scotch how many words I write every day, and I said, I don't know, I keep going, maybe 1,050. He said, that much? You don't have to. He said, set a limit and stop. He had written by that time, I don't know how many books, 3 or 4, and he continued writing them after. But that was suddenly the best advice I ever had. If you say, I will write 500 words a day, I won't stop until I hit 500. And as soon as I do, I'll take the rest of the day off. It then becomes more pleasurable. You're not trying to scale an entire mountain with a summit up there mocking you. You're just doing a hill, and you're doing a series of hills. And over time, the number of pages you write accumulate. And, at the end of whatever, 5-6 months, there's enough to actually, have a workable piece of literature. So that's basically the secret that David gave to me, which I've been passing on every time I talk to a group.
Good advice. Thanks. So it's not just a scientific adventure story, but it's a dark political story. And a lot of it, by the way, takes place in Washington and the Washington area, which through all the symbols of order in Washington, the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, which become symbols of disorder in your book. So your time as a foreign correspondent, of course, in Poland, where you covered solidarity and had to experience, covered an underground movement that, and you spirited your dispatches out of Poland to the New York Times. It struck me in reading this that must have been a factor in that you used your imagination to recreate in this nightmare political situation that you describe in the novel.
I don't want to compliment you, but you are a very close reader. You hit on something there. When my wife, who is here, and I lived in Poland, we arrived in 1979, and it was so-called normal communism. And then solidarity happened. Lech Wałęsa jumped over the wall in the Gdansk shipyard. The country went on strike, and the Solidarity Free Trade Union was born. It was 16 months of liberalization that was fascinating. And then came martial law and sudden repression. Well, the Poles, most of you probably know, have this great history of fighting for independence. No matter who, or even fighting to get their country back once it had been, partitioned for 121 years. So there was this period after martial law when the military was running the country, which is a contradiction of communism. You're not supposed to have the military in charge. And there was resistance. For example, the news was on at 6 o'clock every evening. And what did the Poles do in the major cities? They took their television sets and turned them facing to the windows, turned them on, and then walked up and down outside on the streets. That was a way of kind of mocking the news broadcasts. And they had incredible networks for underground literature. And they had tremendous ways of making fun of authority. There was one member of the Central Committee who was a main actor. And of course, he was hated, absolutely hated by most Poles. And he was appearing in a play about 8 months after martial law. And people wondered how the audience would respond. We went to see him on opening night. He came out from the wings, and there was applause. And we were kind of amazed. They're applauding this guy. And he was very pleased. He smiled, and the applause continued and continued and continued. And he wasn't able to deliver his opening lines. I mean, it's that cleverness of turning the system against itself. So there's a hint of that in the book, which comes because when people are resisting an authority, they can be devilishly clever in how they do it. So you're right, there is an element of that in the book.
So another thing, John, to press the close reading still further and knowing you for so many years, the main character that you open up with his name is Jan, and that's very close to your name. And in his and one of the plot or narrative elements is his search for his identity, because he doesn't know, or he discovers that his father, that his parents aren't who he thought they were. And he then sets on this odyssey, and it becomes it's a fascinating way of telling the story. So, so at the risk of reading too closely, but this reminded me of your own journey, of which you wrote in this other beautiful memoir that John has written, that called "Almost a Family," where he and I know John had talked for years and years when our friendship first got forged about his interest in discovering the identity of his father, who was a reporter for the New York Times. And when we were both working on 43rd Street, there was a plaque on 43rd Street to your father, who was killed during World War II. But the death was a mystery that you pursued for many, many years with your brother, and culminated in this book. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that aspect of pouring that part of your own life into this novel.
Well, I had not heard until you mentioned it or thought of that. I guess that does always lurk in one's, in the conscious or even subconscious mind. The question of a son and a father, is a very powerful theme in not just literature, but in all of our lives. And in my case, I was 11 months old when my father was killed. He was a war correspondent for the New York Times. I was never going to be a reporter when I was growing up. That was to fall to my brother, who was 2.5 years older. He was the one who was going to be a reporter. He had a column actually in junior high school in the local newspaper. He's a wonderful writer. He went off and became a Rhodes Scholar. He loves the 18th century, and especially in Europe. His specialty is France. But he came back and worked for the New York Times for 1 year as a beginning reporter and hated it, hated every moment of it. And finally, when he said he quit and walked out of that building, he felt a sudden relief. And it was one of the happiest days of his life. And suddenly, when he left, I thought, well, maybe I could try that. And I went to visit him when he was in this trainee period at the New York Times, and he was at what was called the Shack. The Shack was right across from the main police headquarters on Center Street. It was an old tenement, like 4 floors, next to a bail bondsman and a gun shop. And it was populated by these old-time reporters for the tabloids and every newspaper in New York, and then some young up-and-coming reporters who were being sent there to kind of, learn the trade by their home desks. That was my brother's case, and believe this or not, he would come to work carrying a copy of Playboy, and inside Playboy, there would be an historical paper that he would read, the exact opposite of everything. So I went there one day. I was at Wisconsin. I was home on during a vacation. And there were all these reporters, including some younger ones, and they said, let's go out for lunch. I was fascinated by the Shack because every bit of mayhem that happened in New York was fed into this one place. So you had your finger on the pulse of the putrid side of New York. Every fire that was anywhere in the city would register in these bells clanging, and some kind of code that only the older reporters could decipher. The older ones had like 5 or 6 different words for suicide, depending on how it was done. And they were kind of as much like cops as cops. There was just a thin line separating them. So I thought this was all really exciting. And then what happened, the reporter said, right, let's go out for lunch. So we all went down. I told them, Mulberry Street, and we went into a wonderful Italian restaurant, and they left one person behind to answer all their phone calls from the different home offices. And that person would call, every 10 or 15 minutes when some news was breaking out. And there was a long table, a lot of food spread out, and the phone was on a kind of wooden column. And a reporter would answer the phone, and it would be this one man left behind at headquarters, and he'd listen. He'd say, 2 alarm fire in the Bronx, no injuries. And he would say, no, not a story. And he'd hang up. And this was a wonderful lunch. Afterward, it lasted 2.5 hours. I thought, this is really a good profession. So I went into it. He didn't. It took years for me to kind of wrestle with the idea of who my father was. And what I wanted more than anything was to go abroad. And Steve and I, he mentioned we were at City Hall. We were lucky enough to be there. I say lucky. Reporters are lucky when bad things happen to other people, but they're on the scene. That's a truth that's hard to acknowledge, but it is true. And we were at City Hall when the fiscal crisis broke out. And nobody knew what this would mean. New York couldn't pay its bills, couldn't pay its police, its sanitation workers. So it was a front page story every day, day after day. And on the strength of that, I got what I wanted, which was a foreign assignment, going to Africa. And 3 weeks before I was to leave, I came to the office on 43rd Street, and my little mailbox, I saw an envelope. And I took it to my desk and opened it, and it was sent from the Chicago Tribune from an archivist there who said, "We found this notebook in the bottom of a filing cabinet, and I notice it has the name Darnton on it. So we think it may have been from Byron Darnton, and I checked, and he was a foreign correspondent for the Times, so I'm sending it to you." And it was just ended up in my box. And it turned out to be the notebook he was carrying at the moment of his death in Papua New Guinea. He was off coast of a tiny village called Pangi, and a plane went overhead. And he writes in the notebook, he gets up early in the morning, he describes the scene, he's taking notes on the mountains and the mist over the mountains. And then he says it's something like 7:40, he puts the time in, plane overhead. And then there's another note that says plane returned. And it says Jap, that's the word they use, Jap or ours, ? Then there's another note that the plane drops a bomb and it kills a man on board named Fonstock. He says, Fon hit. And then the next thing, the page is ripped out. So that was the second bomb that killed my father in the back of the neck. And this was, at the time, MacArthur wrote a note, and it was a big deal. But it was not revealed until much later that it was, in fact, friendly fire. It was an American plane that had not been notified that there would be American troops on a boat in that particular place. So in doing the book, we went to this village. It was very hard to get to because there are no roads.
You and your brother?
Me and Nina.
Or you and Nina, yeah.
Right? And there were no roads to it. We had to go by boat, and we had to, we made contact with someone who knew the area, because in PNG, you don't just step on someone else's land. That can even be a kind of hostile act. You have to ask permission, and usually you have to bring some kind of gift or something. So this fellow knew how to do this, and he brought us there. And we had a long time of negotiating with the people there, who received us very friendly. But then we went into a kind of a long house where the chief and the son of the chief were. And the son of the chief began to talk about his father, who was there, but seemed very, very old, and how his father never got anything from the war, but the Americans who went to war, the government took care of them and gave them money, and they really looked after them, and that didn't happen. He was getting angrier and angrier. And finally, I just wanted to talk and see if anyone remembered anything. And this fellow who had arranged for us to come, I looked over and he had fallen asleep. And then finally he woke up and he said, have we come to the money part yet? And basically he negotiated a payment for us to give to the village. And as soon as that was struck, the whole mood changed, and they brought food out and everything. And they said, there is, in fact, a man here who remembers that event. And we were taken over to a man who said he was, I think, 6 years old at that time. He remembered on his way to school, and he said the bombs overhead, and one of them landed near a small boat. And then he said the white men brought two dead people and put them on the beach. And he took me down and showed me where the bodies had been. And I suddenly felt this power, this emotion that had no way to describe it, other than I know there were elements of kind of anger in it and loss and everything else. And I think that became the key moment of that book that maybe in a sense allowed me to write it. So that theme, the theme of searching for a dead father, I think resonates in a lot of what I write, even if unconsciously.
So interesting. The but I think that this experience that you describe, and for people here, I mean, and for young people, the world that you describe of the police shack and the bells going off and, is unimaginable. I mean, it's just, it's like it was 200 years ago. And I remember when I was when I went to India and you were deputy foreign editor, you said to me, there will be one day that you're wandering down a road and no one is there and they're out of communication with the whole rest of the world. And you'll think to yourself, isn't this amazing? You know, that I could have this adventure. So I just think the story you just told so beautifully must be a part of your DNA to tell stories. What do you think of that?
I guess. I do like to tell stories. When we have 3 children, and every night I would tell them a story, beginning with the same kind of opening, and then a different story every night. I love listening to stories. I think storytelling is just kind of the way we deal with the world. It's the way we make sense of it all. And I especially like scary stories. I like to read stories. I love to watch movies. I'm addicted to Netflix series. I think stories really, they bang around in my head from the outside or inside most of the time. Yeah.
So I can't help but mention before we go to questions here, which we'll do in a second, your other book that I love, which is a novel about a murder mystery taking place at a large metropolitan newspaper in New York, where it's sort of like a satiric Agatha Christie novel where a journalist who is perhaps widely despised is murdered, and we never know, or we take a whole book to find out who it was who did it, because there were so many people that wanted this person. So for anyone who worked at the New York Times in that period, it was pretty unmistakable who the characters were. How much trouble did you get into?
Well, actually, yeah, it's a series of murders of editors. And I didn't get in trouble, but I was once in an elevator, and I heard from the back of the elevator, somebody said, "Take some nerve for you to come back in the building." But, I mean, people accepted it as humor. This one editor he's talking about was a fellow who was very powerful on the copy desks, and he scared all the copy editors, and he would write scathing memos. And only he was allowed to write in green ink. Nobody else in the newsroom, imagine that, was allowed to use green ink. I mean, how did that ever come about, right? That shows you the kind of tyrannical reign that this man had. So finally, his memos, which were collected into something called greenies and distributed once every couple of weeks with all these horrible mistakes that people made and everything, was so demoralizing. Somebody higher up in the food chain said, "Why don't you occasionally send out a compliment?" So he did. If he liked a headline, St. Patrick's Day, cashiers ring up green for St. Patrick's Day, something clever like that, he would send a note to the copy desk head saying, "Nice, comma, who?" ? In which case the copy editor chief was supposed to send back, "Oh, that was written by Joe Schmo." And, that was the positive reinforcement. So the book opens when this man, whose nickname in the book was Ratnoff, is lying there dead in an empty newsroom with a spike. The spike is where they used to kill stories. He's stuffed into his chest with a little note that says in purple ink, I changed it to purple, nice, who? And that's the beginning of the book.
Although you changed it to purple, it was pretty unmistakable.
I thought that was a clever disguise.
So this is great. I think, Nick, did you want to go to a microphone? And
I'll go to this.
okay. And
Is this,
anyone else who you can raise your hand or go to the mic.
Hi, John. I'm a former Timesman as well. So two things. The first one very quick. Byron Darnton, but even though it was Barney, do I remember right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
That must have been the plaque I remember. And I think he was the last New York Times correspondent killed in the line of duty, so to speak, until Nathaniel Nash in 1996. Is that right?
Right.
And then
right.
Anthony Shadid died in
Right.
somewhere in the Middle East.
Exactly right. And there was somebody named Bob Post, who was the other correspondent during World War II. He died he was in a plane, and the plane was never just disappeared off the face of the earth.
Oh. So thank you, especially for the how-to. I'm going to go now back home, write 500 words, and start a novel. You made it seem easier than it really is, I'm sure. But as a dystopian kind of novel, and nowadays there's kind of a notion that things are so awful in this country, or polarized, and that the news is kind of like an airport thriller novel, the actual news. So is it, I guess we'll see when the sales come in, but is there more or less, does that make it that there's a more or less of an appetite among readers for the kind of thing that was kind of an escapism in part? Literature too, but escapism. But there's escapism in real life. I mean, people will spend the whole day talking about speech yesterday by Trump or something like that. And the news is so much more wild than when we covered it seems.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And the jury is out. I mean, typically for escapism, somebody would want to read something that's light and bright and very kind of optimistic, I would think.
And certainly different from their life.
Yeah. And you're right. There is this kind of gloom upon the country now for whatever reason. I'm particularly bothered because I do honestly think we're in a race against time when it comes to carbon. And you look around, you see all these things happening now. It was 126 degrees in New Delhi, the place where Steve was, 2 days ago. That's really reaching the point of danger for human being, for a human habitat. We all know all the extreme storms that are happening and everything. And so there are people doing good things, and we are using more solar energy, and there are some controls on emissions from automobiles. So there's some progress being made. But if we spend the next 4 years under an administration that doesn't believe in climate change, and Trump has actually said it's a hoax, and turns back all the EPA regulations because that lies within the authority of a president, I think our goose is going to be cooked. I mean, we have to make continual progress from now on. And maybe even that's not enough. We'll need some kind of scientific breakthrough, I think, to be okay. So I think we are, in fact, at an absolutely critical choice point in existential terms.
Right. So maybe that
want to
the
give
answer
somebody else a chance.
That it's not just an escapism. There's a real warning here.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have a question? So, John, so I'll ask you another question. So you are curator of the very prestigious Polk Awards. And so you get a chance to review the best of the best in journalism. How would you say journalism has changed, and how equal to the task is journalism today?
Well, yeah, the change has been tremendous. I've been doing this, I'm not sure, about 12 years, maybe 11 or 12 years. And over that time, we get about 500 submissions, less than the Pulitzers, but by and large the same ones. And I've noticed over that time a diminution, a real decrease in prize-winning, worthy submissions from the regional newspapers. It used to be that when we convened in January and went over these things, there were so many from Chicago or Boston or Dallas or LA that it was really difficult to figure out which ones, rose above the others, and there were great discussions. Now there will be a good submission from Los Angeles, but it'll be one. And you have a sense that one was engineered somehow by people because they wanted to win a prize, and they put a lot of money and effort and resources into a single worthwhile project, and it's good. But where are all the revelations about city councils that are, kind of fostering corrupt contracts and things like this? There don't seem to be as many of them. On the other hand, there are now all kinds of other platforms, including online publications, that are doing great things, good things. There are still journalists out there working away. Young people still go into the field with that same energy and the desire, to make an expose that will make a difference, that will, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, as the saying goes. So, yes, there are young people who want to enter the profession. Yes, the journalism schools are filled with candidates. There's excellent work being done in small scales, but there's not local newspapers to really carry it anymore. And there are these online publications that live for a while and do great work, but are they really going to be there for the long run? And do they have enough of a scope to really look at everything that's going on the way some newspapers did? I'm not too nostalgic about the so-called golden age because I know there was a lot wrong with it. When there were so-called gatekeepers and things like this. But I think things are pretty dire now in the newspaper industry.
Yes. Why don't you go to the mic just in case?
Hi, my name is Joe. I actually worked with your daughter Akira at CBS News for many years, and I was just wondering at what time period you lived in Washington D.C. and if that experience is an influence at all on your writing.
I was in junior high school. I went to Alice Deal Junior High School. A long time. Well, 1950s. So, but I remember today Connecticut Avenue and Rock Creek Park and all that. And, it did help, actually, because Washington figures in this book. I remembered where the Naval Observatory, where the vice president was. That's a key place in the book. I remember where Richard Nixon used to live. His private house. Somebody I knew, a friend in junior high school, would go and throw eggs at the house. Couldn't do that these days.
Didn't you say you were White House correspondent?
No. I've never covered Washington.
Oh, okay.
No.
But it is interesting that the iconography of Washington figures so strongly in the novel that as I said earlier, it reminds me of Hitchcock movies where, the chaos is always taking place, at like Mount Rushmore or the United Nations or whatever, symbols of stability. So that you had fun with that, it looks like.
Yeah, in the future, the Washington Monument has a giant hole in it up top, and bricks, parts of the marble keep falling down, things like that. The mall is gone. The mall is used instead as a long runway for these planes that will go up and seed the stratosphere with this stuff. And the city's kind of deserted. Very gloomy because there's no sun. There's a kind of heavy cloud hanging down, like a sort of blanket over everything. It's not a place I'd want to live in.
So we only have a couple minutes left. Go ahead.
John, in the book, the color X comes up. How did you come up with this? Blue becomes X.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you heard that question, but it's a very interesting one, given Elon Musk, that the color blue, which gets blotted out by the Cocoon, is they can't even use the word blue. They call it X. How did you come up with that?
Yeah, well, I thought, if in fact this scheme were put in place and we can't see the sun really, it's a kind of dim thing, the sky would disappear. You wouldn't see blue in the sky, right? And then you wouldn't see a blue ocean because it reflects the sky. And the color blue is fairly rare in nature. You could fill a page barely with anything that's naturally blue in nature. It's not like orange or red or especially green. And I did hear on NPR many years ago a science lab that said maybe blue did not exist 2,000 years ago, as recently as 2,000 years. There's no blue in Homer anywhere. It's the wine dark sea. There's no blue in any of the Hebrew texts or the ancient Chinese texts. And so what happened? Was it possible there was no blue, or meaning we couldn't perceive blue? So I looked at blue as a color, and it's fascinating the things that have been written about blue, because it's very vulnerable. It's the lowest on the spectrum. Some people claim babies don't. The last color they can see is blue, and that blue has this contradictory quality to it because it's the most powerful emotional color. It can be both melancholy and serene. How can that be? And if you think of our use of the blue, whether it's Madonna or Muhammad or UN uniforms or police uniforms or as a color, it's very, very evocative and yet very rare. So in the book, it disappears. And the authority, the dictatorship ensures it doesn't come back because they want people to lose the ability to perceive it. So there is something called the color guard, whose job is to go around eradicating blue wherever it appears, in museums, in nature, robin's eggs, lapis lazuli, wherever it is, it's gone. And it becomes a symbol of the resistance. And so that's a kind of a metaphor, in a way, for something dramatic that has to come back. Yeah. I thought this would be weird.
Yeah. Okay. What about blue eyes?
Wow, blue eyes, as you perhaps know, is an illusion. There is no pigment of blue in the eye. There is a brown pigment, and your eyes can be legitimately brown, but blue is an illusion. It's light hitting the eye. And if you lose the ability to perceive it, nobody will have blue eyes anymore.
What color would their eyes be?
Gray.
Well, I think that last exchange about the colors gives you a good flavor of why this book is so interesting and well told. I'm getting some hand signals that we've reached the witching hour. So I want to thank John for first coming here to talk about his book. And I think this is going to be on YouTube at some point. So you can, yeah. And there's an audio file on the Politics and Prose website. And thank you most of all for the honor of inviting me to talk with you today.
I would like to thank you, Steve, for coming. And let's go and tell lies about the good old days.